welcome on to Searching for Mana. Guys,
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
pleasure to have you on the show. This week we have Arthur and Kathleen Breitman with us of Tezos fame, business that I don't know if you'd call it a business or a foundation, or we'll
Open source protocol.
an open source protocol.
Yeah.
It's white paper was around 2014 and went live after an ICO 2018.
No,
2017.
there was no ICO.
Well,
Okay.
There was a fundraiser in 2017, and then the network in its prevailing form launched in 2018. So
There we go. That's the accurate version. And if you look at what's going on right now, just to redefine it, it's a decentralized open source proof-of-stake blockchain network that can execute peer-to-peer transactions and serve as a platform for deploying smart contracts, which lends it. And the really exciting thing is the user cases that are coming around now that we'll talk through, things that people will have heard of like NFTs and so on and so forth. So excited to have you on the show. We'll cover a bunch of stuff. What would be really kind of you if you could, to start off with, explain to us what you guys are up to right now that's really exciting.
Sure. So, I mean, I do different things. I try to be present in the Tezos ecosystem.
Yep.
Partly in my capacity as a council member of the Tezos Foundation. Also, that's largely a it's kind of like a board position, and so it's not managerial. But I also try to connect people together. When I hear about an application developer who has a problem with a wallet, I know the application developer, I know the wallet developer. I try to put them in touch and create things in the ecosystem like this just by interconnecting people. And I also do a bit of a research on the design of protocols in general.
Thank you. And Kathleen?
yeah, I mean, I would riff on what Arthur's saying and say that we're basically the yentas of the Tezos ecosystem. Matchmaking and kind of connecting people. It's a benefit that we have from being so early onto it. We kind of know everyone in the space, and we have a unique vantage point. But I don't think we own anything right now, or that we're particularly working on something that's specific. It's been a lot of dipping our hand into a lot of different projects because we pretty much know everyone.
And in terms of how that ecosystem is set up, there is open source developers, a couple of hundred who are at any particular point working on various projects within that ecosystem. And could you just elaborate on, what you're not necessarily managing, but what you're connecting and...
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a great way to frame it, because it's really a hodgepodge of different people, organizations, projects working on this.
Yeah.
So you have take a team, for example, Baking Bad, which is a Russian team, and they're building developer toolings and block explorers among other things. They work full time on this, and they have a really, really good offering, but it's also I would say an important part of the ecosystem, because many people depend on those tools for building their own for building their own application. And so I, for example, regularly will catch up with them to see hey, what are you up to, how are people using you, what are the needs, trying to find the gaps in the ecosystem. So that's one example. There's a company in France called Nomadic Labs, which has about 60 people on staff doing a variety of things. They're doing some business development in France, but they're also doing a lot of core development. They are, companies in Japan, Singapore, Dubai. It's a bit everywhere. Some of them work very closely with the Tezos Foundation. Some of them work much more at the periphery. Maybe they are working on several projects. One of them will be related to Tezos. So there's a bit of a gradient.
Why would those examples choose to use the Tezos network versus some of the other well-known, such as Ethereum, Polkadot, and so on?
Well, it depends what they are doing. It's the choice you're making if you are a tool developer, for example, or if you want to contribute to the protocol, or if you want to build applications, can be driven by many different desires. So, for example, we it's an open source project. We get open source contributors. They may be attracted by the fact that, hey, I love the project from a technical standpoint. It's really interesting, and I want to contribute, to the core protocol because this is so cool and interesting. It's also the fact that because we have such an open way of doing proposals to upgrade the network, anyone can come in and contribute proposals. So if you're working on if you're trying to work on a core of a network like Ethereum today, the odds of your improvements making it into the core protocol is very, very low. In Tezos is very, very high because of how it upgrades. So I think it's very attractive to people.
Also that it consistently upgrades and it's not a multi-year coordination.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you could build something and 3 months after see it live inside. That would be a best case scenario, right? But 3 to 6 months after see it live.
And as the network matures, basically what we are starting to see is like more teams collaborating with each other and like more introductions of people as basically the network gets mature, but also like awareness expands on the upgrade process.
Now, if you're in applications, like that might be different. Why you're choosing Tezos as an application? Some of the reasons people have chosen Tezos for building applications have been the low fees. So the cost of making a transaction in Tezos is fractions of cents, and on networks like Ethereum, it's been hundreds of dollars.
Yeah.
So this is both a function of the fact that, well, there's more demand on Ethereum, so just because there's more demand, the price of transaction is higher because the supply is limited, but also the fact that there's just like simply more capacity on the Tezos chain, and it's something that's been improving constantly.
That is a pretty big source of upgrade proposals, is improving transactions and transaction costs.
So for example, just this month, we have nearly 6 million smart contract calls on the chain, up for 3 million last month. So we've just like doubled in a month.
Yeah.
But if you compare to July, the actual consumption of computing power in blocks has actually diminished.
Right.
And the reason for that is because the improvements of the execution environment have been outpacing the demand. So that's a nice thing. The environmental impact of a proof of work chain compared to proof of stake chain has also been a reason for people to choose Tezos.
Yep.
And the longevity as well. The fact that based on its upgrade mechanism, it has a prospect for being there for a very long time.
Yeah.
So you can, especially if you're doing things like digital collectibles, knowing that, hey, this is not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Like if I put it here, it's going to be there in 50 years. I think that's a very compelling point to use Tezos.
And as as newer networks kind of fall in favor and out of favor or whatever, I think one thing that the Tezos blockchain has going for it is that there is no like CEO of Tezos. There's no like central figurehead that kind of dictates what's going forward. People actually do feel empowered when they use it, and that's I think always been a great differentiator. Is that it's not as much of a cult of personality or key man risk associated with it as there might be with other I guess more venture-backed blockchains.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you guys are on the Searching for Mana show, so we're obviously trying to find out about your superpowers. We'll do that more directly at the end of the show. We can talk about team and culture and ideas around that. But what's interesting for me is we're at a point now where it certainly seems like we just talked through the numbers, the amount of use, that this is going really well. And so it's an interesting point to look back around 2014. I know I might have got dates wrong. When you were thinking and you were conceptualizing, well, what might work better. And I believe, Arthur, you were right at the kind of inception point around Bitcoin and, thinking through, what is that the right way to go here? Is Ethereum the right way to go here? So the question is, where we are today is a masterclass that you saw several years ago, and it's just coming right, or actually is it refining from what your original view was?
I mean, there's a lot of elements of the original view from 2014 which have proven very prescient and are very, very strong. So I think in 2014, Tezos position paper was the first to start talking about governance in the space of blockchains. This is not, this was not a thing at all.
Well, it's a common misconception, or it's I guess a timeline confusion that like the block wars happened before the Tezos position paper was
Yeah, the
published, but it actually came after.
The Tezos position paper talks about governance. It talks about smart contract risk, and some people are saying, "Oh, it was just a reaction to the block wars. It was just a reaction to the DAO hack." But actually, it predates all of this by 2 years.
Yeah.
So that and that vision has remained pretty strong. Now, that being said, with hindsight, back in 2014. Like, would I want to build things differently? Would I want to engine things differently? Of course, otherwise it means I would have learned nothing over the past 7 years.
It's a good thing it's self-amending, though. So
yeah.
There's nothing we can do that can't be undone.
It's very, very humble of you to say that. But if we took a particular point that I believe has worked in your favour, which is the proof of stake and it being more environmentally friendly, and over the last couple of years there being a lot of attention on others not being so, it's a big question, but was that thought through, or actually that's just worked in your favour?
Well, I actually don't think that has worked in our favour ultimately.
Yeah, I mean, so I think a bit. So I think it did help NFT adoption a bit in the past few months.
It's been good in the last 6 months.
Yeah. No, it's helped quite a bit, but it was not. So the environmental aspect was not. It was not a design consideration for proof of stake.
If you read the position paper, for example, it talks about conflicts of interest, and it doesn't really get into.
The motivation for proof of stake is that it's so much cheaper than proof of work.
Yeah.
So it's a lot less expensive. It's also a lot less. Socially costly, and one example that Dan Robinson from Paradigm gives, to explain what's the difference between proof of work and proof of stake. At the end of the day, there's always values that's locked up. Isn't there a cost? So the idea is that imagine you have a village and you have a ritual for a sacrifice, which is you take a cow and you drop it into a volcano. Okay, well there's clearly a cost to that. You have less than a cow, and now you transform the ritual, and now you sell the cow for $100, and you throw the $100 in a volcano. Obviously, the cost is not the same. The social cost of doing this is not the same at all. So you can have a lot less cost. Now, the thing, the argument for proof of work, and for the environmental cost of proof of work is that you basically have to believe that energy is mispriced. Essentially, if you're saying when you buy energy, you're not actually paying the full cost of this energy because there are externalities which are associated with it. So that's the argument, but that's a separate argument, and I think. The cost argument is actually stronger for proof of stakes than the environmental argument. The environmental argument follows, but with a few steps removed.
Yeah, and it did make some parts of working through Tezos much harder. Proof of work has an elegance to sort of initial launch and getting people to participate in the network easily.
Yeah.
And proof of stake, a lot of the hassles associated with the launch of the network in 2018 were associated with the cost of doing proof of stake first. Ethereum has had the benefit of basically memeing itself into proof of stake without actually having to do the engineering part. So maybe that would have been the best of all worlds. Just say you're going to do it and get the benefit of that.
Yeah.
But I guess that's kind of a big part of our personalities as people is that we would not be able to do that.
No, it was very important for me for Tezos to launch was proof of stake from day one.
The switching costs were just kind of ridiculous.
It's not just a switching cost. I think it was just about the ethos of the project.
Yeah, the integrity of it. If you're going to have people vote into the network, and the baking was a huge part of also what got Tezos really popular when it launched.
So it's fascinating to talk about the technical thinking that went through. So thanks for doing that. Let's put that to a side because we just mentioned ethos. Let's talk about that. What is that at Tezos, and what do you hope for it to afford? And obviously doing the research into this, you guys are very much about inclusion and against traditional banks and so on and so forth. If that's true.
No.
Well, I mean, Arthur worked at one. I think we want to create a good alternative to the traditional financial system in some ways.
But I like to say that there's no such thing as at Tezos because there's no organization named Tezos, and it's a big tent. People come into the project and they have very, very different views. There are some people who are attracted to Tezos because they really dislike the banking system. They think the banking system is bad, corrupt, whatever have you, and they see a powerful alternatives. Other people see it as empowering creators. So there's not a, I have, a specific ethos that I wanted for the launch of Tezos, but beyond that point, I can have my own ethos, but that doesn't make it the ethos of Tezos as a whole.
But it's a platform, and obviously, like, it's meant to facilitate, certain transactions. And I think, as the cryptocurrency space more broadly kind of comes to the fore and gets more popular, there are like distinct attributes of different blockchain projects that make it characterized in one way or another. And I do think that there's a flavor and essence that people use to describe Tezos that's different than other projects.
No, I agree, but that's purely like phenomenological. It's not, it's not prescriptive or anything. I did try to write a blog post. I write a blog post called The Philosophy and Values for Tezos before the launch. But the idea was explicitly to this was a proposal. It's like, hey, you know what? Let's all try to stick to these values for the project. But it's not, it's not self-enforcing.
If you read a lot of like the early writings from me, Arthur, like any number of people who watched Tezos, basically it's the whole concept behind this is like to watch out for points of centralization through like charisma and kind of bullying leaders and things like this.
Yeah.
So it would be very hypocritical.
So I understand.
if we
just to get on my point on banks, I don't have I don't have anything against traditional banks. I think the main problem with traditional banks is they're not bad. They're just bullied into being bad.
Yeah.
So I understand to not refer to it as a company, and that there was a lot of thought put into thesis and how it could set off in a certain direction. But actually now it is evolving based on the creators in the economy. And you said to some people, the side that like the ethos, like empowering creators, and then technically that's because, as you said, you're much more likely to have impact if you update in more real time. And so, if that's where we are now, that's gone incredibly well. Your involvement, like you said, is around the edges and, connecting the dots in the ecosystem. What do you want to happen next in the ecosystem, ideally?
I mean, the best thing that have happened in the ecosystem is things that I, didn't predict or anything like that. And so, one of the big success for the Tezos chain is an art marketplace called Hic
Yeah.
That came out of of this creator in Brazil, and I think that I think it was part of a hackathon initially, and so it's just spun up and was immensely successful. And so, I don't think you can make this type of success happen, or you can't engineer them. What you can do is you can ensure that the tooling is adequate for this to happen, so that if someone wants to build something, they will have good developer tools. There are going to be good wallets. There's going to be all the infrastructure that you need to actually build this thing. So it's kind of like, you don't want to centrally plan a city. It doesn't work, but you can make sure that you have the plumbing that's running well.
I also think that Hic and its success is also very reflective of like what we want to see in Tezos, which is like people taking the scaffolding and like building on top of it themselves. So the reason that Hic took off is because there were a few generative AI artists who said like, hey, this is really cool. It's eco-friendly. Tezos isn't Ethereum. It doesn't have those egregious fees. And they started to self-organize and have hackathons and like residences and a few months later, sorry, it feels like years. But a few months later, it's like, there's a lot of tooling that was built not from the, hackathon, but in fact from people who actually post art to it. So it's a little bit of like digital homesteading, right? Like they are attached to it not because some VC backed it or whatever. They're attached to it because they actually built out tooling that they want to use, and they want to have some sense of ownership over the site and the marketplace around it.
Yeah.
And I think that, the best case scenario for Tezos as a project is probably something akin to this. Like people take it upon themselves to make, proposals to the network. Which, just I think we kind of brushed through that at the beginning, but basically Tezos, made the Tezos position paper makes the observation that Bitcoin lacks a mechanism to upgrade itself, and that technical improvements to the protocol could be done better through a formal governance mechanism. And so anyone can basically, well, almost anyone, there's obviously qualifications to everything, people who own tokens in the network can propose upgrades to it. And then
anyone can propose. You don't need tokens.
Anyone can propose. Okay, there
anyone
we go.
can propose, but you have to, you got to have the tokens to vote.
Yeah, fair enough. So right. So you can make a proposal to the network. And then people ratify it, and it's upgraded by the ratification of people who own the token. So the idea is fundamentally very different than a lot of other blockchain projects.
Does this work better the more people that come in and are participating in ratifying with tokens?
Well, it certainly makes it more legit.
Yeah, definitely. I think it helps. At the end of the day, this is open source software, which means all of these things can be copied, they can be forked. If tomorrow, like all the code, everything that's been developed around, almost everything that's been developed around Tezos, I'm sure, like there's some companies who are developing proprietary code, but like everything around the open source project, anyone can come in, like copy it, run it on their own with almost no restrictions. And so if they do that, you have a question of like, well, which one is the real chain? Is this one of this or the copy? And so at the end of the day, it boils down to legitimacy. Yeah. Because when you have assets which are purely subjective, their value is purely intersubjective. Money is intersubjective in the sense of like it's not valuable because the piece of paper you have is valuable. It's valuable because we've all agreed that yes, this is a legitimate representation of value. So it's based on legitimacy, and so the more people vote, the more legitimacy you have to a proposal.
Yeah. And so is part of the effort and challenge right now trying to attract more people into the ecosystem?
Yes, although the type of people, a lot of the people, there's a big difference between attracting people in the ecosystem to be application developers and so on and so forth, and attracting people, for example, to be validators and validating the chain. And you don't want to be artificial about. You really don't. You can create an incentive for the first one. You can create programs, hackathons, and so on and so forth, all this stuff. You want to be very careful about the second one. We've seen, blockchain, VC-backed blockchains basically create programs to attract validators, where they essentially pay people to come in and validate the chain, and they say like, oh, look how many participants you have. But if you're paying them to participate, it's not really, they're not really independent participants to this thing, and it's not really sustainable. I think your set of validators doesn't matter if it's not organic. Yeah. So that's something you want to keep purely organic. And I would say for applications, you'll have more success with everything that's organic. But at least I think for applications, things like helping with VC funding, grants, all of this sort of stuff. I think they can help with ecosystem building. With validators, I think it's a bit of a different business.
And with the application developers, if somebody's on the cusp of trying to think through whether they would like to come into blockchain and develop smart contracts, then what is it that you're looking for beyond the technical capability?
Yeah, so I think Arthur has more familiarity with taking people from outside of industry and kind of anointing them to what he values in the technical aspect of this. I think that's been like a big part of his philosophy insofar as like you've had to work with people.
Yes, no, I do. So, in general, it depends what you're doing. Sometimes if you have a core teams who are looking for more developers, there's often a mistake that recruiters do. And this being a recruiting agency, I can talk about that. That may be relevant. Which is say, we want people with blockchain experience, like blockchain. And my general philosophy is that if I'm going to work with someone, I'd much rather work with someone who's a great developer and knows nothing about blockchains than someone who knows a lot about blockchains and is not a great developer. Because it's a lot easier to teach a good developer about the few things they need to know than it is to teach to someone who is not a who knows a lot about blockchains but who doesn't know how to develop, how to be a good developer. Same thing goes for DeFi, by the way. You have a lot of people who are very ignorant about finance building DeFi protocols, and it doesn't work. Yeah. And people get surprised. And there's always some people who basically think that these things are unknowable. You see this a lot. like people will say, oh, well, who knows if the tech can work or doesn't work? You see different teams and maybe this will work, maybe this won't work. And like, no, if you know a little bit of finance, there are things which like plainly do not work and cannot work. And there are things which clearly work. And you can see it. And so you have a lot of quants who have actually gone into the DeFi space and who are smart about it and who are very innovative. So there's a tendency sometimes to think of like, well, if you come in the traditional finance side, clearly you're going to be blinded by your bias and you're not going to see the beauty of like this. No.
There's something we said though for the fact that like this is at the intersection of like several genres of things that you could individually be an expert in, right? And come in with priors about things, but then like be completely turned away because you don't know anything about I don't know, computer science or something like that.
But the thing is like it's so multidisciplinary.
Yeah.
That you're not really going to find the skill you need, which is why you're better off like going after really smart people who can pick this up,
or
rather than trying to look for specific expertise.
Or beyond that, like people who are smart and also curious, because there's a bit of I think when we've seen people come into the space and they've done very poorly despite being extraordinarily intelligent, it's mostly been from like blind like unwillingness to kind of ease up on like one or two opinions that they might have had.
There's a phenomenon where people go into the space and lose 20 IQ points because it's blockchains. It's really it's fascinating, but it happens.
Yeah.
You see it with like with some VCs. You see it with like even developers and such. It's like it's not everyone, right? But there are some people who, like they're outside of this context, brilliant, and then in this context, it's like, oh, but no.
Yeah, and it's mostly like made up problems too. It's really weird. I
think the people who do best here are like very analytical people who try to think from first principles, because the reason this happens is I think if you try to read, like most of the writing about this space is very bad, and so if you try to read stuff, you read the press, you read what people write about it, a lot of it is going to be nonsense. And if you can't say no, that's nonsense, and like go from first principles and rebuild it yourself, I think you're going to be like you're going to base basically in this like kind of metaphor based thinking around the thing, and it's going to it's going to make you brain dead. And so
the number one way to piss off Arthur in an interview is to like just tossing out metaphors all the time, and he just goes completely nuts. So it's a good way to get his goat.
And then I just respond a flat no. It's like you mention a long question with a metaphor, isn't it kind of like, and you just say no.
Yeah, no, that is not.
I'm a delight at parties.
So we're talking through the type of characteristics that one might have if it would lend them to coming and working on the ecosystem, which raises the question now, what you guys have running through your career from a mana perspective. So both familiar with mana from gaming.
I know about mana in Magic the Gathering.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
That's
That's the one then.
Yeah,
so
that's what we're talking about.
Just to recap for any of the audience who might not, you have power, and then you also have mana, which is the potion of magic, and so this could be the sword or the spell that you can cast. So to either both of you as a couple or individually, what's your mana?
I'm not sure I understand mana well.
I think. Can I try to suggest what your mana is?
Oh, that's even more fun.
Yeah,
let's absolutely.
This is
do
like
that.
the Newlywed Game, but like worse. So I think Arthur's mana, as we say in the States, is that he is a very, very curious person, and he basically, if he wants to understand something or if he wants to solve a problem, he will focus on it. Basically, people take drugs to be as focused as Arthur when he wants to like understand something, and he does so from like first principles, and he gets really, really rigorous about it, and basically obsessive. But I think what's fundamentally like driving that is a curiosity to know everything.
Okay, that's interesting, because I thought of mana as not a skill you have, but a resource you have that lets you use that skill. You know what I mean?
In your personality.
I see. Because I would have thought that, maybe my mana was Coke Zero, you know what I mean?
Oh yeah, well that's what Arthur consumes to facilitate all of this, because he would wither away and die if Coca-Cola went away tomorrow.
It's like mana is what you consume to like do your magic, and not what the magic is.
Well,
but maybe I'm wrong, and you were spot on with the definition of mana in this show. So
I think for for the interest of the audience, both is useful to know. So so for that curiosity and extreme focus, your microdosing is Coca-Cola and Pepsi.
Oh, it's not microdosing.
No, it's micro consumption.
Yeah, it's
macrodosing.
I would say like send Arthur some syrup and some carbonated water, and he'll be off to the races.
I get it. So that's what needs to be full in the tank to then have that focus. Arthur, has that ever been detrimental because you get so curious and go so deep into the rabbit hole?
Oh yeah, of course. There's the problem is that, sometimes you really need to go in depth, and sometimes you need to decide that, there's basically diminishing returns to going in depth, and sometimes it's better to actually look at the big picture as opposed to just drill down the rabbit hole. And sometimes I will nerd snipe myself, and I will work on a problem because I'm obsessed with the problem and because it's interesting, and not because it's the most important problem that I need to be attending to.
Yeah.
So it can definitely be a weakness.
How early on was that characteristic obvious to you that you had that, right the way back in early school?
No, when I started working, when I started in the professional world, because when I was in school, when I was in school, the topics I was working on in school were topics that I was feeling very obsessive about, and so I was doing very well.
Such as?
Mathematics, physics, computer science. Or, I would decide that I was not interested in it and I would not do well, but I didn't care. There was not much at stake. And when I really started working and there were different problems and I was asked to work on a certain problem and I was more interested in another one, it was very, very difficult for me to focus on something that wasn't at the moment the thing I was interested on.
Do you like equally learning about something where there is a result that's absolute and you're learning to understand it, or do you prefer when there is no answer?
No, I prefer when there's a clear answer and that you're actually going towards a goal, and then you find the answer, and then it's clear that this is the answer and there's no further questions.
Which I find pretty funny because you're actually a pretty creative person.
Yeah, I think you're creative about the path to get there.
Yeah.
And you enjoy the journey, of course, but it's nice to know that there's a destination to the journey.
Yeah.
Because once you go into the type of new dimension that you're operating in, there is that creative element of this can't complete almost.
Yes. I think Arthur often has wacky ideas, and then he tries to basically find the most direct and clean line to get there. And I think that's a lot of your hobbies, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think so too. But
and Arthur, what would you say Kathleen's manner is?
That's a good question. I would say there's a very
coffee.
Yes, coffee.
Yeah. Arthur used to
make coffee.
Yeah, my maiden name's Kathleen McCaffrey, and Arthur used to call me Caffeine McCoffee when we were dating.
Large. I would say that if you want caffeine, Coke Zero is a much more convenient way of getting your caffeine with coffee.
Arthur often complains about the temperature of coffee and how easy it is to spill everywhere.
Yeah, it's very inconvenient as a beverage, but I would say that it's extreme pragmatism, and it really complements my skill because it's very very different. It's very, very much goal focused, and say okay, we want to do this. Here's what we need to do, and a no nonsense attitude.
Why, thank you.
Yeah. Which is in rare supply in our industry.
So that does sound like it combines and contrasts really well. I'm sure in and outside of work. Kathleen, give you the floor to respond to whether you agree with that. Pragmatism.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think I basically treat professional endeavors a bit differently than Arthur does. In the sense that Arthur has more of an obsessive personality, and I just I want to do the thing right. And I think Arthur's mandate is usually more broad and far-ranging, and I care a little bit more about doing the thing.
The outcome.
The outcome, yes. Whatever that may be.
Look at you, caring about the outcome.
I know, it's weird. But no, to your point, I think it does actually complement one another quite well. And we often, there's sort of the level of wanting to get something done, and then the way we get there is usually divvied up pretty easily once we figured out all the component parts to it.
Because if we took an example the voting that happens, You could take it back to just thinking through whether that's the right thing to do or not. And so if you have somebody who looks at the outcome and you have somebody who's, I'm not saying both you don't in contrasting ways do this, of course, but in the extreme version here, you're looking at the outcome, and Arthur, you might be deep into thinking about the here and the now and what you feel is going to operate best. You could say that the voting is akin to populism, and is that the right thing for the ecosystem? How would you decide if you disagreed who's going to make those decisions, or is there always a way that you know who's going to be the person on each topic?
Well, with the Tezos, blockchain and everything associated with the cryptocurrency stuff, Arthur, there's a very clear division of labor where Arthur is, clearly more technically savvy than I am. I think I defer to him a lot on the. I defer to him a lot on the technical decision making.
But that's technical decision. But actually, in that instance, where I very poorly described a scenario,
so just
it's
to
more
take it a step further, there's clearly a technical limitation to how you could, create a voting system in a cryptocurrency, and so that's the first constraint, because we don't actually just have a wide open field. We have the limitations of software.
Yeah.
So figuring out the design from there is more of a negotiation, to your point. Yeah.
But it's funny because the accusation of populism for the voting system, I've heard it, but in general, people complain that it's not populistic enough, which is
well,
funny. The complaint is that it should be one person, one vote. Instead, you have vote based on stake, and so the rich get to decide, and so we actually have a populist criticism of the voting system.
Yeah. So it's when we say that you can vote on things in Tezos, it's not like it doesn't map perfectly to democracy.
No, and it's not the purpose. And there's something interesting about democracy and the ways that people perceive it. And you can look at democracy as instrumental, or you can look at it as terminal. And so, in the instrumental view, you have some idea of what is good governance. What is a good state of affair from a political standpoint. And you decide that having too much power in the hands of the government or a few people is dangerous, and that you're going to temper that by having democracy. So democracy is a tool for having a good political order. And in the view of democracy as intrinsically desirable, instead is no, there is no absolute good. There's no such thing as a good political order or a bad political order. Reflecting the will of the majority is what defines good and bad. And so therefore, you have democracy for democracy's sake. I am
forms of relativism.
Extremely firmly in the first camp, with even some skepticism as to how good, how effective democracy is as a tool to achieve that. But the question you have to ask is if you had something, if you could make if you have certain political values and you thought there was a change to democracy that made those values more likely to be reflected, would you support less democracy if you knew it had this outcome? And if the answer is not clearly yes, then you're more of a relativist who thinks that somehow values are determined by popular opinion. That's not my case. I'm a moral absolutist, although I am a subjectivist, which is.
It gets complicated.
But so the thing for Tezos is that at the end of the day, the voting period has 3 votes and they require an 80% supermajority. Essentially, when you are at these levels of such high threshold for change, it basically doesn't really matter what the shape of your voting system is, because if you have more than 80%, you probably almost have value. It means you have a very, very wide consensus base, and so it's not the outcome is not going to be very, very sensitive to the design of the mechanism, which I think is what matters here. So it doesn't really matter if it's voted by stake or anything like that. If it's 80%, it's very wide.
It's probably not that controversial,
exactly.
which is part of what you're designing for, right? If you want an upgrade to the protocol, you want it to be something that everyone agrees is good because you want them to continue using the system.
But it is a choice. The system is biased towards being wary of changes. So the system is biased to be somewhat conservative towards changes, because there is value in having stability in a system and predictability.
And you know, to be sure, like I think that's part of the reason that most of the upgrades have been to date very technically oriented, because you have these sort of secular goods like, oh, we want, you know, lower transaction fees, like obviously, and improvements to the, you know, smart contract language and things like that. So it's all been pretty vanilla.
But you could, and possibly already have, see things occur that wouldn't be your particular choice, and so you've made the decision that if that majority votes for it, then it proceeds. But where things can come back to the powers that be is if you can tweak that system. So can the system be changed at all in terms of voting?
Yeah, the voting can be amended. So people could decide, you know what, we all agree that this voting system is too conservative overall, and we want it to be a little more, you know, a little looser. That's totally possible, and it has happened.
Yeah, and in fact that was kind of the, you know, first thing. But one of the things to note about Tezos is that it's very much inspired by Nomic, which is a game that was created by a philosopher out of Princeton called Peter Suber. And it's worth kind of maybe Arthur going through like what happens in a Nomic game when someone is trying to be cheeky.
Yeah. So I mean, the game of Nomic, first of all, when people think of the game of Nomic and think of like designing a protocol, they say, oh, that's a terrible idea, because if you play Nomic, it goes into crazy directions, right? And the game of Nomic essentially is you start with a very simple set of rules, and then those rules provide for their self-amendment. So people pass new rules and pass new rules and pass new rules, and so the game can take any direction. But the players who are playing Nomic are trying to have fun. They're trying to make the game fun and trying to trick the other people and so on and so forth. It's clearly not the attitude of people who participate in a blockchain network. That's the first thing to notice. But there's also, you know, people who analyze this type of games, they will mention some tricks you could play. So one example is, let's say you have a voting procedure. So you could say, I propose a change to the rules whereby I'm going to get $1 million worth of Tez or what have you, and everyone who voted for it is going to get also a small reward, and everyone who voted against it, you know, will be will actually be punished. So now, as a voter, you think, well, you know, if it passes, then I should vote for it, because otherwise I'll be punished. And if it doesn't pass, then it doesn't matter how I vote, so I should vote for it. Yeah. And you know, in practice, if you actually try this in a Nomic game, most people are going to say like, nope, take a hike, and that doesn't actually work. So it's just like one example.
I think that's kind of like the interpretation of Tezos as populist, though, is that it turns into a game of Nomic, but like actually it's meant basically oriented to be much more conservative.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I fall in this. That's a very long-winded way of coming back to the question.
So many people who've created, super impressive businesses come from some type of term-based strategy fascination early on. If you look at Reid Hoffman, for instance, with LinkedIn, I think he studied PPE, something like this, and was deeply fascinated in various
which game?
Term-based strategy types of games.
Sure, but I was not aware that LinkedIn was inspired by a turn-based strategy game.
No, I was just saying that people who tend to do this also have this characteristic of being interested in turn-based strategy.
Oh yeah. No,
it's a trend.
It's
very interesting.
Yeah.
Because
nerds.
We've had the occasion of working with people who are really deep into turn-based strategy games.
Yeah, basically, like the company I started after the Tezos network launched is mostly like Magic the Gathering OGs. So it's been a lot of the conversations get really nerdy, really quickly.
I mean, not to. It's not always the right guy to bring up, but like Mark Zuckerberg as well, right? He very famously was obsessed with one particular game, which was conquering the world, and Elon Musk is thinking the whole time about what political system would you, when you do land in Mars, right? What would you've got a fresh canvas there? Is it separately attached to what happens on Earth? Yes, it should be, and therefore, how does that all work? It's very interesting to read through the thing there.
Well, he's also obsessed with like Caesar and a bunch of he's obsessed with classics.
Yeah, that's right. Very cool. So when you've kind of got to think all of that through, and then you see it in the real world happening, then it could be drawn relatively closely to some type of cult you get this a lot in the blockchain and crypto space. Do you think Tezos is a cult at the moment?
Goodness, no.
No.
Yeah. A lot of the stuff in the space really creeps me out.
And and a lot of people try to make it in, try to create cults.
Yeah.
I really dislike that. I mean, I'm like ferociously individualistic, and so for me, anything that's cultish, anything that goes against basically individual values is something that's a little abhorrent to me.
So no tattoos.
No,
no,
not for us. Yeah, though it's
a shame.
It is funny when we see it. We're like, huh, the logo looks good for a tattoo. I'll give it that.
That doesn't have, that doesn't make it culted. Like if something is very meaningful to you and like so meaningful that you want to tattoo it, I think that's what I'm saying. It's
that's just
like,
a form of self-expression.
When it gets into rituals and this type of thing,
yeah,
it's like
or like quoting from someone and say, oh, so and so says this, and like not really thinking too much about it. When it gets it gets creepy.
So we've taken a lot of your time. Thank you so much, guys, for talking us through a lot of the journey, what's going on. Just to finish, really, be good to just finish on NFTs because we're 2021 September time, and certainly NFTs are one of the most trending things around at the moment, and it's very exciting, and Tezos is playing a huge part in this. Could you elaborate on any stories that the audience might want to listen to, please?
Stories about NFTs.
Well, no, I think like basically what's been going on in Tezos, and we mentioned earlier that Hickok is one of the largest marketplaces in the world for NFTs in terms of daily active users. I think the strategy, insofar as like we have an opinion on NFTs, we don't think it's cool so much to have like picture a JPEG of a rock selling for millions of dollars. We think what would be really cool is like using NFTs as a way to empower creators, empower fans, and allow people to come together, because ultimately cryptocurrencies are building social consensus among groups, and I think that it's ultimately like a social technology. So the more people who come together for different auspices, but mostly just to express themselves and to take part in the ecosystem, obviously the better it is. And if it comes to be the case that they do this because they really love, a F1 team or a football team or something like that, then more power to them.
Yeah. Do you agree? We've seen this with Ronaldo's transfer in football, and I think Messi's, and I'm not a massive football fan, but certainly read the press on that. And then in Formula One, you guys have a tie with McLaren, I think, recently announced.
The foundation sponsors.
But why is that good? What's happening there? It's like previously people had like fan cards and they'd collect them, and that's great. But now they can kind of, by having the NFT, have a stake in the profit of.
No. So look, people love collectibles, but the world has moved to become more and more digital. Today's like how many pictures have you printed recently? We used to have a lot of like artifacts, physical artifacts that we kept around, pictures, music records, DVDs, all of this, and books. And it's it's not just because it was convenient to have the object. We also like the idea of collecting the object. But when everything started moving and becoming digital, you lose that collectivity aspect. When you start streaming all your music, you don't have the joy of collecting. When you are playing video games and all the items in your games are just virtual, you lose that. And where I think NFTs and blockchains get in is that like gaming studios or music sellers they've not really been able to replicate that collection, because if all you have is an entry in a database of some corporate entity, you don't really own it. They could take it away from you. You don't have this sovereignty angle. If you have an NFT, it's really yours. Like you possess it; it cannot be taken away from you.
And it lives on a decentralized, network if you're lucky. I think just going back to the Magic the Gathering theme, if you go to a Magic like conference or any sort of big event or gathering, just statistically like 50% of the people there are there to like play a game and be in a tournament, and then another 50 are just collectors. Like they love the art, they love building out card collections basically as a form of self-expression. And I think that's something that NFTs uniquely facilitate in this day and age that the internet has struggled to capture before, is basically showing off what your preferences are as a form of self-expression in a way that's really difficult to Arthur's point, kind of take away immediately.
So you must and most probably are right or could you skeptically say that it's because people assume that they're going to be making a good investment?
I mean,
I think there are people who are trying to gamble basically on the value of these things.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think that the vast majority of art, for example, that's being sold right now on places like are for people who genuinely want to collect these things, and you see it because you see that it's primarily primary purchases, like people who just buy it and just like the art and are happy to support the artists and do that.
But you don't see people hold it for very long, right? If you look at how frequently the NFTs is traded, which is great from a trading perspective.
Well, it depends. It depends which NFTs. I mean, what we see on Tezos is one thing. What you might see on Top Shot is different. And I think it's also like what the platform encourages versus,
Yeah, I think that's why people like Hikiknug, is because it's not really trying to do this like ham-fisted, like give us more transactions, like we'll show you this, and displays with the front page that are, basically trying to entice people to buy and resell quite a bit.
Yeah.
I think that's a big difference in, having something that's like venture-backed versus having something that like grew out of a hackathon.
I mean, you can have gambling games which are like basically a hot potato type of gambling game. So like a bunch of people decide that they're going to buy something and sell it to each other until they all, at some point, someone decides to stop buying it, and people like gambling this way. I'm not going to throw the stone, but I don't think there's going to be necessarily like a huge future in that. But I do think that collecting is something that has existed for a very long time and is going to keep existing for a very long time.
Yeah, and this is the new platform to do it on. And from the example of artists, it's fantastic. People who are creating to have something that's being received and not just put onto the database, as you say. I mean, that's lovely to watch, but I think, and I know you guys obviously do as well, there's just certain aspects to it that won't remain and are not as healthy. So we'll see that play out.
There's a novelty factor that I think took over with the NFTs earlier this year, and like now we're starting to see things shake out a little bit more, and I think you'll find, when we have a discussion about this in a year from now, it'll look much different. And that's just the way that new industries work. So
the other thing is that I would say as a collector, let's say, for example, let's take a more traditional arts collector. You buy a piece because you like it and you want to hold it, but you say, hey, you know what? If I do come on a hard time, maybe I can still resell it, and so that in a way lowers the purchase price, because if you purchase something and the resale value is 0%, it costs you more than if there's some resale value. And so as a collector, if you find a piece that's like underpriced, you're saying like, well, that's great because I get to collect the piece, it doesn't cost me as much, and if for any reason like money gets tight, at least there may be some resale value in it. So I don't think a person like this, who's buying to collecting is like gambling or necessarily speculating on a piece, but they do take like the store value aspect of the piece into consideration when they make the purchase.
Yep.
Which is just reasonable. Yeah.
Yep, makes complete sense, and I'm excited about for a fine piece of art where a community of people can have some type of ownership in it as well.
Mm-hmm.
You can't buy a Van Gogh for 80 million unless you're extortionately wealthy, but to be able to have some type of ownership in that piece is nice. There's that attachment to it.
Yeah, and I guess there's two very different things that you can do. There's some form of fractionalization, or it's purely subjective. Tomorrow you could sell an NFT that represents a fraction of a Van Gogh that you don't own, but you're not claiming it owns a piece of the Van Gogh. It's like you spiritually own. Like how many people are willing to buy a spiritual part of like a painting from someone who has no connection with the painting? I don't know, but maybe if you're a hair of Van Gogh, you say, my ancestor painted this piece and I'm doing this. How did it go? Okay. So there's this one aspect. The other one would be to say like, no, actually, I'm going to take like this painting and I'm going to wrap it inside a company, so I should have the company and do that, and then we'll have some bylaws for if someone wants to buy the piece and so on and so forth. That's much more of a financial product, and I think it's super interesting as well. But it's qualitatively different from the first kind.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, thanks for coming on the show. Incredibly impressive what has happened in your space and in your world recently, and we look forward to see what's next.
Thank you so much.